Let's see, I'm going to start reading to you guys. The sky to the west was dark with heavy black clouds. Arlene didn't like it at all. He was 11 years old, almost a man by the standards of his village. But right now he felt much younger and very unsure of himself. His father was away, and the weather seemed threatening and unnatural. He stayed close to his mother as she stood staring down the slope of the mountain, watching the men of the village haul the heavy water wagons back up the winding stone-paved road. Oxen would have been better at hauling this, but the village had no place to graze oxen on the rocky mountainside. What little arable soil they had was all reserved for human needs. That meant that the men of Obsidian had used their own muscles to fetch water up from the river. In another year or two, Arlene would be big enough to join them, but for now he stood beside his mother and watched. Arlene's mother fanned herself with one hand, while the other clutched at her black and gold brooch, holding her collar open. The air was thick, hot, and stagnant, and her gray dress was soaked in sweat. "I can't stand weather like this," she said. I'm always glad to see winter come this year." Arlene looked up at her, though not far up, as he was almost as tall as she was now. He always liked winter, and had never entirely understood why the adults didn't. In winter, the mountain was covered in snow, well, except right up to the crater, and he and the other children of the village would go sliding down it. There was plenty of cold, clean water available for the melting, without having to haul it up from the valley where the streams ran dry. He could play outside for hours and come in and warm up by the fire, and no one would order him out of the way or ask him to help with the chores. Even the adults had less work to do, so why did they hate it? Yes, there was less food, and it wasn't fresh, and the cold seeped through everywhere, and the fire had to be kept. But still, Arlene thought that winter was wonderful, and anything was better than this stifling, hot, humid summer, when the sun didn't seem to want to show its face and hid behind a thick haze of clouds. This wasn't how summer was supposed to be. There should be bright days and rainy ones, not these endless, smothering, gloomy days when the clouds hung overhead but the rain never fell. This was ugly and exhausting. It had rained in weeks and the crops were suffering. The water the men were hauling up from the river would help, but a good cistern-filling rain splashing down the mountainside and pooling in the rocks would have been better. Those clouds in the west looked even uglier than most of this year's skies. Maybe they'd bring storms and put an end to this nasty heat, but their appearance was not promising, and Arlene didn't trust them. His grandfather, his mother's father, his father's father was long dead, stepped out on the rocky ledge beside them and looked not down the slope at the water haulers. He was too old to assist, but out at the clouds. "Dragon weather," he said with a frown. "Oh, nonsense," Arlene's mother said. "You've been saying that for weeks. It's just a hot spell." "Isn't that what dragon weather is, Mother?" Arlene said. "A hot spell?" His mother glanced at her father. "Not just the heat, though, man," said. "Look at the sky. Hot as a furnace and days dark as night. That's dragon weather. You need the heat and the dark. If those clouds move in and settle here, that's really what we'll have." Arlene looked straight up at the sky overhead. It wasn't dark as night, but it wasn't very bright either. The summer haze was thick and foul with the gases from the smoking peak of the mountain. The fumes had been thicker than usual lately, but whether that had any connection with the weather, no one seemed to know. Arlene had heard the adults arguing about it, but the arguments were never settled. "Why is it called dragon weather, grandsir?" he asked. "Because it's the sort of weather that brings the dragons out of their caves. They can't abide cold or light, Airy. In the days when the dragons ruled over our ancestors, the world was warmer than it is now, and the great beasts darkened the sky with their smoke so that they could come out by day as well as night. When the weather's dark and hot now, old and tired as they are, they still stir in their sleep, and sometimes they awaken and come out to feed you." Arlene stared nervously at his grandfather. The old man spoke in a deeper voice than usual, his storytelling voice. It made his words seem more important and more ominous. "Don't mind him, Arlene's mother said. "That's just stories. No one's seen dragons in hundreds of years." Her father shook his head. "No, Charbeth, you're wrong. When I was a boy, I saw a village where a dragon had been not long before. I may be old, but it wasn't hundreds of years ago." "Tell me about it," Arlene said. His grandfather smiled down at him. "Are you sure?" "They say it's bad luck to talk about the dragons, just as it's unlucky to speak too much about magic." Arlene nodded. "Tell me about it, grandsir." Grandsir looked at the sky and frowned, then back down at Arlene, his smile reappearing. "I was a year or two older than you are, and my uncle Sterlian had once taken me to a trading journey down to Benth and Tara to meet a caravan that was passing through. We saw the ruins on the way. We had had a hot summer this year. and for a few days the smoke from the mountain had been much thicker than usual and had collected in the valley over in the Sandalwood Hills. He pointed over the shoulder of the mountain. Arlene had never been to the Sandalwood Hills, but he had seen them from the crater rim and knew that his grandfather meant. The dragon must have come out late that summer, the old man continued, and no one discovered it over the winter. When we got there in the spring, there was nothing left but charred ruins and bare bones. And how do you know it wasn't human raiders who destroyed it? Arlene said. Those bandits in the south are surely bad enough without worrying about dragons. The borderland bandits never got anywhere near this far north, he said, and human raiders don't leave 6-foot claw marks. And neither do dragons, Charbeth said, her hands on her hips, because the dragons, if there really are any, stay asleep in their caves, deep beneath the earth. You must have just imagined those claw marks. They were real, and they were claw marks, her father insisted, but without much vehemence. Arlen realized that the two of them had undoubtedly had this argument many times before, as they had had so many, and had worn the passion out of it. His father and grandfather argued, his mother and grandfather argued often, and had done so ever since Grandsir had first come to live with them. He could barely remember a time when Grandsir had not been there, or when his mother did not argue with him. I'm not going to listen to your nonsense, Arlene's mother said with no great anger. I'm going to go see those men have something fit to eat when they get those wagons up here, something to keep their strength up. She turned and started back towards the house. Arlen hesitated. He wanted to stay close to his mother and help out when the wagons got there, but he also wanted to hear the grandfather's story. It wasn't one he remembered before. He wanted to know more about the dragons and what had become of them. Are you coming, Arlen? His mother called. She paused and looked over her shoulder. No, Mother, he replied. I'll stay here for a while with Grandsir. She marched on across the rocky yard toward their thatched roof home. Grandsir looked down at Arlen. Eager to see your father and brother back, he asked. Arlen nodded. Tell me more about the dragons. His grandfather laughed. Mail. That's my boy, he said. What do you want to know? Have you ever seen a dragon, Grandsir? The old man shook his head. Of course not. I'm still alive, am I not? There aren't many who have seen dragons and lived to tell. 1 second. There must be some people who've seen them, or how will we know anything about them? A fair question, his grandfather said. He glanced at the water haulers and judged it would be a while before they reached the village and settled down cross-legged on the ledge into a better position for storytelling. Arlen settled beside him. Yes, Arlen's grandfather said, there had been a few people who saw dragons and lived to tell about it. Most of them were a safe distance, and the dragons simply didn't notice them. But there had been a few. His voice trailed off. A few what, Grandsir? Arlen looked, trying to see what his grandfather was staring at. The old man shook himself. Nothing, he said. I just don't like this weather. Then he smiled at Arlen and said, of course, there were a few who got a good, close look at the dragons. There might be even some of them who are still alive today. Arlen nodded. From the village in the Sandalwood Hills, you mean? Oh, no, Grandsir shook his head. Nothing like that. I saw that village, and there wasn't so much as a rat left alive. There were just bones and cinders. But there are old stories, very old stories, about dragon venom. Venom? Arlen frowned, as Grandsir had said. Most of the adults of the village didn't like talking about the dragons. There were so many superstitions about them that most people thought it was safer not to discuss them at all. Dragons are magical, and magic was wicked and untrustworthy, and speaking too much about it could attract misfortune. Still, Arlen had thought he had a reasonable understanding of what a dragon was, and he didn't remember anything about venom. I thought dragons breathed fire. Well, they do, after a fashion, his grandfather said, or so I'm told. But the older stories, the ones from the early days, the years of man, say that dragon flame isn't so much fiery breath, as some people would say, but a spray of burning venom, like a snake's spit of poison. Except dragons somehow set their poison ablaze, and thereby spit flame. Arlen shivered at the thought of it. It seemed somehow more real to know that dragonfire was burning venom rather than some sort of magical breath. It made dragons seem more like actual beasts rather than spirits, or illusions like the little images the village sorcerers sometimes conjured up. Whether it's the truth or not, I can't say, Grandsir continued, but there are stories, very old stories. So old I don't know where they came from. They say that sometimes the venom doesn't catch fire properly. It's still deadly poison, of course, a poison that will burn the flesh from your bones. I do hope you enjoyed. Sadly, there was 3 extra minutes. I will try and catch those up on the next chapter too. Please leave comments. Thank you very much.